Thank you everybody so much for joining us today for our webinar on cultural humility and therapy, considerations and best practices for the Latino community. Your presenters today are Annie Maldonado and Bethany Jorgensen. Before I introduce your presenters for today, I want to go over a few key reminders. The presentation will go up until about 2:45, 2:50. We will have a Q&A session about 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the hour. So if you have any questions you would like to submit for the Q&A session, please feel free to use the chat box. Please remember to mute your sound throughout the whole presentation. And if you are comfortable, you can turn your video on. As I mentioned, your presenters today are Annie and Bethany. Annie is a fourth-year school psychology candidate at the University of Utah. She is passionate about working with families and creating equitable accessibility to evidence-based practices for minoritized communities. Bethany Jorgensen is a school psychology graduate student also at the University of Utah. Bethany works as a graduate clinician for the U-TTEC lab and provides school-based therapy in Park City School District. Bethany is interested in the accessibility of evidence-based interventions for families in minoritized communities. Welcome, Annie and Bethany. We are so excited to have you here today. I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Annie. We're both very excited to be here. Just a little background about why we are both interested in this topic. I'm interested in this topic because I currently work as a therapist in Park City School District, where many of my clients speak Spanish as their first language. I also studied Spanish in my undergraduate, and I lived in Puerto Rico for a couple of years.
Hi, and I think this is really important also for me. I consider myself a Latina. I'm also an English language learner. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico and moved to the States in my teens. I am also married to a past DACA recipient, which we'll talk also more about today. And as Annie mentioned, I'm interested in equity of accessibility to evidence-based practices for minoritized and marginalized communities.
So the reason why we wanted to talk about this topic is because, and why we find it is important, is because currently there is a growing population of Latinos in the United States. Currently, Latinos are the largest ethnic or racial minority in the United States and are 16% of the US population. And because of this, there is a great need for providing quality care and for equitable access of care.
Yeah, I think, as we begin the presentation, we really just wanted to note that our goal is to bring deeper recognition and appreciation for the Latino community, their traditions, their values, and their history, so as to allow us clinicians to be sort of more aware of their experiences, but never with the expectation that we will reach sort of perfect understanding, right? And we also want to acknowledge that Latinos are multiracial, multicultural, and that not all Latinos have the exact same experiences. And so our hope is that everyone will come into the space with a mindset of cultural humility, where we have awareness of the limitations to understanding a client's cultural background and experiences, while also being open to sort of learn more or what you haven't learned just yet.
So now I'd like to review a couple of cultural considerations that we can use when working with Latino speaking students or clients. So the first thing we want to consider is the Latino culture. And in the Latino culture, they are known for its collectivist family orientation. So what this means is that Latinos tend to be highly group oriented, and they have a strong emphasis on family as the major source of one's identity and protection against the hardships of life. This sense of family belonging is intense and limited to close family and to close friends. And people who are not family or close friends are often slow to be given their trust. The family model in Latino families is extended. So that means doesn't just include the nuclear family, like parents and children, but also includes all the cousins, all the aunts and grandparents and uncles. And in these families, the decisions and behavior of each individual are based largely on pleasing the family. And so decisions are to be made not by the individual, but as the family as a whole. And so this is especially important for clinicians to remember, because it's important for them to know that these decisions are often going to take time and multiple parties are going to be involved. The next thing we want to consider is the importance of personalismo. And personalismo is personal connectedness and interactions. And so what this means is that people in this community find deep meaning in relationships and their ties to the people that they care about. And so when we are working with Latino clients, it's important to remember that they are looking for this close emotional interaction with the people that they work with. And so it might be hard if they're working with someone who doesn't come from their culture, and they might seem like hurried, detached, or like business-like, but this could negatively impact the therapeutic relationship. So just recognizing the different expectations that our clients might have and being able to address those in a professional manner. Lastly, another thing to consider is the respect for authority. So in Latino culture, there tends to be a high power distance, whereas in Anglo-American culture, there tends to be low power distance. What this means is that in high power distance culture, there's a high power distance in between with those who have authority. So recognizing that those in the Latino community might view like doctors or teachers or elders as someone who has greater authority than those that they interact with. And so recognizing this is important with the therapeutic relationship, because they might see the therapist as someone who has greater authority than them, and they'll have this respect for authority. So recognizing how this could impact the therapeutic relationship. The last thing is that being bicultural and bilingual is a protective factor for both youth academically and for mental health. It can be a great protective factor academically because students are able to draw on both their native language and the language that they're learning when learning concepts. And it also is a protective factor for mental health because there are many people that they can reach out to in their extended family for support with mental health.
And it's so important to keep this in mind while also considering some of the past historical events that also are significant within the Latino community. And without going too deep into like a whole history lesson, just kind of wanted to contextualize treatment and knowing that it's important to know these events and how they have impacted and continue to impact the Latino community. So, you know, Mexican Americans represent sort of the largest group of Latinos in the US, and it was sort of through the US-Mexican War, which happened between 1946 and 1948. And that was sort of the first significant influx of Latino immigrants that they, and I use sort of the word appeared in the US because Mexico lost a big portion of their land to the US. And so I wanted to show this image here because I think it's pretty significant when you consider how far up Mexico went in terms of how much land they owned. And so when the US took over, that's when we see this influx of large Mexican American immigrants coming into the US around that time. Also, in 1898, at the end of the Spanish-American War, Spain seceded Puerto Rico and other colonial possessions, and Puerto Rico became an unincorporated territory or a commonwealth, and it remains that way today, and it in that way belongs to the US. And so in 1917, the Jones Act granted Puerto Ricans US citizenship, which is a pretty distinctive characteristic of Puerto Ricans, as that's not usually the case for most Latinos. And around that time, it was sort of this economic prospect that brought many Puerto Ricans to the Northeast, especially New York. And then in 1959, there was this revolutionary insurgency in Cuba with sort of an armed uprising that overthrew the government and created a virtually overnight exodus to the US. A second wave of Cuban immigration happened between 1965 and into the early 70s. And it was initially first sort of an elite group of Cubans that came, but emigration continued with balseros, which are people that make the dangerous crossing to the United States by makeshift watercraft. And some of these immigrants, such as the educated professionals who came to the US during the early phase of the Cuban migration, have become pretty well established, but there's also others who have arrived with very few economic resources who are less established. And so you definitely see those differences even within the Cuban migration that has come through the years. And then in more recent years, the pies secos, pies mojados, or wet foot, dry foot policy that was established in 1995 granted Cubans who touched American soil the right to stay and get on a fast-track citizenship. And this ended in 2017. So that's something else to consider. There's a pretty good movie in HBO Max called The Last Rafter, El Último Balsero, that kind of depicts this 2017 policy ending. So I definitely recommend that. And then in January of 2023, so just last month, the Department of Homeland Security announced a safe and lawful way for qualifying Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans with US-based supporters to be able to travel by air and temporarily live in the US and potentially also have work authorization. So I mention all of these things because social political aspects of Latinos and their homes that they're migrating from is really important. There's still so much going on still, even within Central America, there's just so much political turmoil. El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, there's just been so much in the 70s and 80s and even into now, just waves of migrants coming from Central America because of, fleeing the violence in their homes, right? Like gang violence, drug crime. And so this is a lot to consider because we also see a huge number of refugee migrants, including children and women, which we see a lot of when we think about the family separations that happened more recently during the previous administration. And so these are all things to consider because they are things that ultimately impact the Latino community's mental health. And even when we think about paths to immigration, right, there are so many different stories and experiences of paths to immigration that we could have an entire presentation just on this. But some general paths to immigration and the limitations and implications they carry are, I mentioned, being married to a previous DACA recipient, that's deferred action for childhood arrivals, usually called Dreamers. This was a policy that was instated for those who arrived into the US prior to the age of 16, who may have come in illegally or overstayed their legal status, to be able to have temporary work permits and to sort of reapply every year. This is something that is currently going on for those that applied in those times. I think it was a couple of years when they first allowed new applicants to be able to apply for DACA. However, the government is still barred under the court from receiving and processing new first-time applications. So these are all things that really impact the Latino mental health, and something that we wanted to bring up more so to help bring awareness of the broader social political implications affecting Latinos, including specific groups.
So now I'd like to review the differences between Anglo-American and Latino culture, which these are important things to consider, especially when we're working with the Latino population and doing therapy or counseling with them. So first, in the Anglo-American culture tends to be nuclear family oriented. So that means a focus on the nuclear family, those individuals who are in your immediate family. In the Latino culture, they tend to be extended family oriented, which is focused on all of their family members, including the nuclear family, and then also extended family like aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins. And that tends to be a protective factor for them, having that great sphere of people who are involved and are a part of their lives. Second is in the Anglo-American culture, they tend not to emphasize supernatural forces, whereas in the Latino culture, there is a great importance on that, especially on the spiritual domain. And so they, a great part of their culture is acknowledging how supernatural forces affect their lives, and then also the use of saints and intermediaries who can affect their lives. Next is in the Anglo-American culture, they tend to focus on autonomy from parental approval, and they see that as a hallmark of optimal adult development. Whereas in the Latino culture, there is continuous respect for parental authority throughout their lives. So they always are being respectful of their parental figures in their lives and any elders in their lives. Fourth, in Anglo-American culture, there tends to be a focus on direct communication. So just saying exactly what you think and getting a point across. Whereas in Latino culture, there is a focus on indirect communications. They tend to use third persons, allusions, proverbs, metaphors, jokes, and stories to transmit information. So there's a difference there in how they tend to communicate with each other. And then lastly, in Anglo-American culture, the people there tend to be task-oriented, whereas in Latino culture, the main focus is personalismo, which I kind of talked about previously, but that focus on having emotional resonance and personal involvement with family encounters or friends. So that great focus on personal connections and interactions with other people.
So Bethany pointed out a lot of differences, and many of these characteristics that she mentioned about the Latino community is also values that they hold. And there are many traditions and values that many Latino families and individuals hold fast to. And that includes religion and faith. So sort of putting God first and relying on his ultimate will. We have many sayings involving God's will, cuando Dios quiera, or, primero Dios, o al que madruga Dios le ayuda, like just thinking of things that are more related to if God allows, and if God is in control kind of thing. And so it's important to think and consider that those are values that many traditional Latino families hold true to. And then as Bethany mentioned, familismo, that's some sort of strong family loyalty, closeness, and getting along with and contributing to the well-being of the nuclear family, the extended family, and kinship. I think that's also something else that's important to consider as we think about the values and the traditional upbringings of Latinos. There also exists many multi-generational households and, sharing living spaces with older generations, parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, etc. And as Bethany mentioned, kind of, respect for the elderly, which also includes taking care of the elderly and that expectation that that is your responsibility to take care of your elderly parents and grandparents. There's also, again, kind of going with the family units and making decisions as a family unit and almost like relying on the opinions of those around you who are family. Also cultural pride. And I included, we included this picture here because it shows like this sort of beautiful dance with many colors. And I think there's just so much richness in the traditions and values of the Latinos, and we often are very prideful of that, of the African, Spanish, and Native traditions that are embedded into this multiracial community. And something else that I wanted to point out is also grieving traditions, right? As clinicians, we might see Latinos that may come to us because they're grieving a loss. And there are just differences that are important to note. We have funeral viewings and sort of burials and things like that are very similar to the Anglo American culture, but there are also differences like in many Mexican traditions, they create altars for the dead and the passing. And that is something that is very unique to their culture. We've also had, especially like that I know of in Puerto Rico, in my country, there have been funeral viewings where the body is not placed inside of a box, right? And the body is seated in a chair or something like that, which might seem very different for someone who may not be familiar with that. And so it's important to think about all of those differences when working with individuals from the Latino community that may be grieving. And again, this is especially important to kind of review all of these values and traditions, because oftentimes, especially younger generations of Latinos may deviate from some of these values, and that may cause some distress. And those may be the kinds of things that you may be addressing through the therapeutic relationship and the therapy itself.
Another thing to consider is that in some families, there may be a stigma against counseling. A strong emphasis is placed on family as the major source of one's identity and protection against the hardships of life. And so in these families, often personal or family problems are kept within the family. And for them, family reputation is everything. And so for some of these families, it's might be all that they have. So recognizing that they might have a fear of counseling because they might think it might lead to labeling or possible judgment. And so it's important to remember this when we start counseling, when we start the counseling with some of these families, that they might have some fear about counseling. So explaining the counseling process to them, what counseling will entail, what you will or will not talk about, and then also involving the family in the counseling process so that they're aware of what is going on and they can have that input as well with all of the treatment goals.
And as we consider the values that we discussed and oftentimes sort of the stigma that we talk about, there's also a multi-generational conflict. I think it's important to consider that these traditions and values, again, can be traditions and values that some Latinos may deviate from, right? We talked about that cultural humility and knowing that we don't know everything there is to know about a specific culture, and coming at it from that mindset is important. And so there might be Latinos that may want to deviate from some of these values and cause this stress. One of the things that I think about, you know, on a personal note, we have expected gender norms within our culture where it's sort of very patriarchal, and oftentimes within the family nucleus, the husband or the father figure is sort of the one that makes decisions and has a bigger say within the family, and whereas the woman is sort of expected to be at home and care for others, right? And this is not everyone, right? And especially the younger generations may want to deviate from that. And you may have young Latinas not conforming to these expected gender norms that traditional families may grow up with. And then that, again, causes sort of a distress for the specific individuals that are experiencing that. On a personal note, I am in my mid-30s and I recently had a baby. However, as soon as I turned 20, my family has been asking when I will have a baby, right? And I am a graduate student, and so my values were a little bit different than what my family valued. And so that's where those, again, distressing thoughts and feelings may come about when there is that sort of conflict between the values of multiple members of a family. And then also those assumed responsibilities. I talked about sort of taking care of the elderly and being respectful of authority figures and all of those things. And again, there's sort of expectation that you might have to take care of your parent who might be elderly, and that may mean dropping everything, leaving work, potentially moving across the country and, you know, watching your elderly parent or grandparent. And again, these are things that may be values that some Latinos may be deviating from, and again, may cause distress. So when working with the Latino community, I think it's important to consider many times those shoulds and musts that they might struggle with, in my community or in my family, I must do this or I should do that. And again, those are things that cause the stress when your own values deviate from those of the family or the sort of broader Latino culture and community. And I think that the goal of therapy in those cases should be to build resilience and to build bridges between the client and their family, and finding ways to find that balance of values that may be diverse or deviating from one another.
Another thing to consider is the language barriers that can come up with counseling. Many Latinos and Latinas want counseling services, but they are unable to receive them because of a lack of bilingual counselors. Many bilingual counselors have extremely long wait lists, and so that can be a barrier to helping Latino families receive the services that they do need. Also, having a counselor who speaks your native language can increase rapport between the counselor and the therapist. And that's something that I've definitely seen working in the schools this last school year with the students that I work with. Many of them, when we're building rapport, would want to talk about like their favorite TV shows, their favorite candies, their favorite toys or favorite foods. And sometimes they would be a little bit embarrassed because they would assume just because of how I look that I wouldn't be familiar with some of those like customs or foods or things that they enjoy. And so they would really light up when I would be like, oh, you love pozole? I also love pozole, and being able to talk about those things together. So being able to understand their native language and to be able to sometimes speak in Spanish with them has been something that's been really helpful for rapport. Another thing to consider is literacy levels. So before someone starts doing counseling with us, we often have them read through and sign consent forms and assent forms. And just because someone speaks Spanish as their first language doesn't mean that they necessarily know how to read. And so that's something to consider as well, that when we are explaining counseling services and asking for consent, to make sure that these individuals understand what it is that they're consenting to, and that they're able to receive that information in their native language and be able to understand what they are consenting to. The third thing to consider is culturally relevant metaphors, stories, and examples. So when I'm working with my students who speak Spanish, I think it's really important to use dichos or like sayings that they are familiar with, and also use metaphors and stories that they can relate to. Oftentimes in counseling, especially with my littles, we talk a lot about different social stories and vignettes, which we talk about, like talk through what the people did and what would be the best way to respond to a situation. So when I use these different vignettes and things, I make sure that they align with my students' values and the cultural customs that are used in their culture. So making sure that they can relate to the individuals in the story, and that the skills that we're talking about and teaching also align with their culture.
So we also think that it's really important to be aware of the cultural bound conditions that appear in the DSM also. And so we're going to just quickly present these to you all, and just to make you aware of those. But susto, miedo, or espanto, it's sort of this condition of being tired or weak from being frightened or startled. And so this is one thing that is very cultural bound to the Latino community. There's also this sort of wind or cold illness. It's almost like a fear of the cold or of the wind, or feeling weak or susceptible to illness because of the belief that there's a sort of natural or supernatural elements that are not balanced. I think we in Puerto Rico call it sereno, and in many other communities and countries, they also similarly refer to el sereno, and it's almost like this, and it's just so hard to explain because it almost feels like this supernatural thing that people talk about, but it's like when the sun is going down and it's getting darker and there's a little bit of dew coming, and it's like, oh, don't step out, you might get el sereno, and so these are things that are important to consider and to think about as you start working with the Latino community. There's also cólera, which is just feeling disturbances in the body like headaches or screaming or stomach pain or loss of consciousness or fatigue because you're so angry and so enraged, right? And so that's cólera. There's ataque de nervios, which is kind of can be considered like a panic attack. But this is a panic attack that may result from evil spirits, right? And so this is something else that we have in our culture. And then we also have mal de ojo, which is like the evil eye. And it's almost like attributing medical problems like vomiting, fear, diarrhea, or even just mental health problems like anxiety and depression because of somebody giving you the mal de ojo, somebody giving you the evil eye. So these are all things that are sort of cultural bound conditions for the Latino community. And the other thing that we wanted to make sure after we talked about sort of the history and all of the different cultural values and traditions that are important for us to know about the Latino community, how then do we treat the Latino community? So we want to talk about sort of best culturally responsive therapeutic practices. One of those things is the biopsychosocial cultural model. And we think that it's important to consider using the biopsychosocial cultural model for evaluating and treating diverse clients, including the Latino community. So the biopsychosocial model, as you see here in this image, emphasizes like sort of that interconnection between the biological, psychological, and social environmental factors that impact individuals. And so you might see here biological meaning sort of that physical health, disabilities, genetic predispositions. With the psychological, we're talking about beliefs, behaviors, personality, self-esteem, coping skills. And then the social and environmental, thinking about those sort of peer relationships, family circumstances, cultural traditions, and social supports. And I think that in addition to thinking about these things, it's also important to consider the culture sort of embedded in all of this, right? And knowing that there are many aspects of an individual's life that impacts their mental health, and all of these things should be considered when assessing and treating individuals. And this also includes social determinants of health, which should be considered for everybody, but are especially important when we think about working with our diverse communities. And when we think about social determinants of health, is what are those conditions in the environment where people are born, where people live, learn, work, play, worship, and age that affect a sort of a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes and risks. And so these are things that are important to consider as you start working with diverse populations, including the Latino community.
Another important therapeutic practice that we should do when working with individuals is to understand their personal cultural formulation. The DSM-5 actually has a cultural formulation interview that can be used to help health professionals gather and organize culturally relevant clinical information. And it has some questions about like the individual's acculturation, their community and family connection, their immigration status and history, and also their education. And this could be a helpful tool that should be used with all cultures and with all of the people that we're working with to better understand the different factors in their life that help make them them, and the different things that could be impacting them in their mental health.
I know that we mentioned this earlier, and we actually started with, this is the mindset that we should come into this presentation with, cultural humility. But we thought that it was important to sort of reiterate it again, and important to come into this work with the mindset of cultural humility, of being aware of the limitations to understanding a client's cultural background and experiences. So, you know, as we think about this, there are a couple of practices or recommendations that we have when thinking about coming into the therapeutic relationship with cultural humility. And that is, be direct. Consider just directly asking your client how their culture, their ethnicity, their language has impacted the way that they interact with the world and the way that they're perceived and treated in the environment and in their community. that can go a long way in opening a door to be able to deepen and strengthen the therapeutic relationship. There may be many aspects of their culture that may be coming into that distress that we talked about earlier, right? It may be those multi-generational conflicts in terms of the values that they hold, that they're kind of deviating from. It may be the way that they are perceived in the community. It may be that they're living and working and playing in a community that may be very different from their own, and the way that they're perceived and treated may be very different. And so it's important to be very direct about asking these things when you're working with any diverse populations, including the Latino community, and especially when your client's background, ethnicity, language, culture is different from your own. And then the other thing that we wanted to bring up is considering using a values-based approach. We talked so much about the traditions and values that the Latino community, the traditional Latino community holds, right? And so it's important to consider when working with the Latino community and clients, that you address their values at the front end, at the forefront of things. Just knowing what it is that they hold dear to their hearts and the kind of person that they want to be, and understanding that will help navigate sort of the therapeutic relationship and always bring back everything that is discussed and talked about to their values.
The last thing we wanted to bring up to consider is supporting collaborative care. Research has shown that supporting collaborative care with Latinos is important for retention and also success of the care. And so it's very important that we collaborate with all involved parties while we're working with them doing counseling. I personally work at a school, and so there's a lot of people that I could collaborate with and regularly do collaborate with for my clients. So I often am collaborating with like the school social workers, the school counselors, maybe the behavioral specialists if they're also involved, and especially collaborating regularly with parents and family about what the different things we're working on in counseling. So that way everybody knows what we are working on, and so they can also support with the goals that we're working on. Another thing to consider is offering additional resources and supports. So offering different resources that the families could obtain outside of the school system or in the community that could also help with just additional mental health resources that could be helpful for their situation.
And then the last thing we wanted to talk about that is very important is, what do we do moving forward? What are some things that need to be addressed in both research and practice to be able to provide appropriate, culturally and linguistically sound treatment for the Latino community? And so there are a couple of things that we want to talk about, and specifically within the literature, there is a big gap about the interventions and practices that provide best outcomes for the Latino community, as well as assessments that are normed and validated, not for the Latino community, but used with the Latino community. And so it's important to, moving forward, those things should be directly addressed to start changing norming practices to include a larger variety of diverse populations, including the Latino community, and to begin to continue doing research that will help fill the gap for the information that we're still missing about what is best practices for the Latino community. And then creating spaces and treatments for the Latino community while involving the Latino community. I think oftentimes we assume that we know best as professionals what they need, but there needs to be more systematic approaches to truly understanding their needs by building partnerships and engaging with the community itself. And so that includes collaborating with the community stakeholders, somebody from the Latino community that will help navigate and understand better the Latino community from a mental health standpoint. And, as we also consider this, we think about how I mean, there might be evidence-based practices that work for a diverse number of individuals, but may need little tweaks, right? And so creating treatments and interventions that are accessible because they've been adapted to be more culturally and linguistically sensitive, and using language and metaphors like Bethany mentioned earlier, and keeping their culture and traditions in mind and values in mind when you're doing the work in therapy and in treatment. And then finally, once we've addressed increasing research initiatives to be able to better understand the needs of the community. And once we've, created or adapted practices to be more culturally and linguistically sound, we need to put, manos a la obra, like we would say, like get to work and start addressing those previous items 1 through 4 in the practical spaces and in the systems that Latinos live in and work in and learn, play, worship, and age in, and starting with addressing how to develop competent mental health providers, right? Bethany also mentioned there is a lack of enough bilingual providers that can support the work. And this is why it makes me so excited that our program got the funding that we recently received to be able to help support social work and school psychology graduate students who want to train to provide mental health supports in schools for the Spanish-speaking communities. And so that's the kind of thing that we need to be moving towards, creating, developing a workforce in the mental health field that will be competent culturally and linguistically to be able to provide services to a large variety of individuals, not just the Latino community, but diverse individuals, diverse in ethnicity, diverse in culture, diverse in language. And so we wanted to make sure, again, that we provided a little bit more information about the Latinos. As I mentioned, we both mentioned before, we don't know everything there is to know about the Latino community, and that is that cultural humility that needs to come into play, but wanted to make sure that we provided a little bit more information so that everyone can be open about what they didn't yet know about the Latino community. But we are also open to questions, so preguntas. And I will also stop sharing for now. Well, thank you all so much for attending and for watching and for the feedback.
Thank you, Annie and Bethany, for a wonderful presentation today. If there are no lingering questions or comments, we will go ahead and sort of conclude today's webinar. One big virtual round of applause for Annie and Bethany for a wonderful presentation today. This presentation is recorded and will be posted to the U-TTEC Lab website and YouTube channel, so you can check it out there. For more information on previous webinars as well as upcoming webinars, you can please feel free to check out the U-TTEC Lab website by going to u-TTEClab.com. Again, thank you everybody so much for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful weekend.